Okay, class, in this particular presentation, we're going to cover the history of immigration policy in the North American continent since the arrival of Columbus. Basically, what I want to do for you is just trace the history of U.S. immigration policy to 1924, to a key act in 1924. So I'm going to take a look at immigration policy and its direct relationship to the formation and control of labor forces. Okay? Immigration policy was first created by England, and then immigration policy is adopted by the United States. So we need to appreciate that immigration policy is directly related to foreign policy. So the focus is on the history of immigration to this country and the creation of policies surrounding the movement of populations. Okay, so we're going to look at policies designed to form and control labor forces from the colonial period through the early years of U.S. national formation, and then we're going to appreciate what are known as the first and second great waves of immigration in the 19th century, and then conclude with the period immediately following World War I, which was an era that witnessed massive restrictive legislation in the 1920s. So I just want to provide the general overview of the policies that were pursued by the colonial governments and then the United States in 1924, so we can kind of get a grasp of the nature of immigration policy, and then when we get specifically to the Mexican and Latin American experience, we can appreciate at least a generalized understanding of the larger immigrant experience with a specific recognition of what Mexicans and Latin Americans have had to go through. So once Columbus initiated the encounter between what is referred to as the Old World and the New World, European powers, especially Spain, France, and England, and then the United States, negotiated agreements for the recruitment of labor forces for the expansion of markets. In the process, international accords were written specifically connecting the movement of populations to the expansion of markets. Spain, France, and England actively recruited populations for the expansion of their colonial markets. Their foreign policies incorporated legal instruments to contract and form labor forces, because they searched for labor forces and created labor contracting agencies throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so these labor forces found their way to the Western Hemisphere. So when the United States was created, the Founding Fathers inherited the British colonial experience that shaped the way the Constitution approached immigration and settlement policy. Immigration was tied to labor force recruitment and participation. Foreign policy was instrumental in securing workers for the expansion of markets. So let's address pre-revolutionary immigration. Prior to the creation of the United States, immigration was so common that colonial governments, British, French, and Spanish, did not regulate the flow of population. So for nearly 2 centuries, immigrants were desired and adventurers were recruited through legal means and through extra-legal means to expand the influence of Spanish, French, and British interests in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the arrival of the earliest European and African immigrants are relatively well documented. The historical record notes that the arrival of the Spanish missionaries at St. Augustine in 1565 in Florida, and then the Spanish settlement of the New Mexico colony in 1598, then there was the founding of Jamestown in 1607, and then there was the arrival of the first slave in Virginia in 1619. So when we get to the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1620, and of course, the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts is celebrated as being the national symbol of early immigration. Really, in reality, it was really late in the period of initial European colonization of territory that later became the United States. But by the 1630s, however, immigration to what was to become the United States was so common that individual arrivals and even the total number of immigrants went unrecorded. And this was so for nearly 2 centuries, during which immigration to the colonies and then to the new United States was largely unregulated by these receiving governments. Immigration during this first phase of American immigrant history differed somewhat from the periods that follow, yet patterns developed that were to repeat themselves throughout U.S. history. Now, can you imagine if there had been an immigration naturalization service in the United States in the 1600s? Remember, immigration to what was become the United States was so common that individual arrivals and even the total number of immigrants went unrecorded. There was no immigration naturalization service. Can you imagine if Native Americans had had a policy by which they could regulate the flow of immigrants coming into this country? Can you imagine?
America!
Finally, we'll be freed from the oppressive regime that's ruled our homeland!
Oh, crap! More white people! They just keep flooding across our border! Oh, sure! Come on in! Take our jobs! Eat our corn! See what we care! And you know the second they get here, they just start having kids.
Oh, totally! And you know what's worse? They don't use every part of the buffalo!
That's it! Tonight, after the rain dance, we talk to the chief.
Come on, rain! Okay, that should give us scattered showers tomorrow with a 75% chance of sun through the weekend.
Chief, every day our borders are being crossed by uninvited foreigners. We have to do something.
Well, if you ask me, and hey, this is just me talking here, I say we shoot them all in the head, make jackets out of their skin, and then leave their carcasses to rot in the sun.
Okay.
Well, I say we welcome them. They're good for the economy, they gave us these comfy blankets, and come on, can anyone here honestly say they don't like fire water?
Didn't they kill your entire family in a raid last week?
Okay, I'll admit there are some cultural differences.
Oh, you pale-face loving hippie!
Excuse me, but paleface seems like a racially charged term. Can we call them something less offensive?
Like what, hugs with trees?
Well, their boots make a cracking sound when they walk. Why don't we call them crackers?
Oh, yeah. From now on, everybody calls white people crackers. All right, so how do we keep these damn crackers from coming here?
We could build a giant fence to keep the crackers from sneaking onto our land.
Oh, come on. You know those crackers would find some way to sneak in. We need enforcement.
I say we lock their cracker asses up. Enough!
Tomorrow I will issue my ruling directly to the crackers. As protector of the lands between Sacred Bear Mountain and Lake Popozao, I declare the following new laws. All uninvited crackers will now be considered illegal crackers, and we can send them back to where they came from at any time.
Send us back to England?
England? We thought you came from the moon. Furthermore, illegal crackers are now required to register with our guest Indian program. And after living in harmony with the land for at least 6 years, they will be given a junior scout card that must be presented at all trading posts, wigwams, wampum shacks, casinos. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Yes, you can what?
Yes, we can live here and work in this new land.
It's a basic human right.
Well, what about our rights?
And how dare you fly a foreign flag in our country?
And how dare you? What are you, like a Wookiee?
I hate crackers!
It's the Eagles. They have come to bring us wisdom. Shh, listen.
Hey, everybody, just chill out, okay, man?
Everybody freaking chill!
Yes.
These people aren't immigrating, they're like migrating.
Yeah, we flight out for the winter because it's too freaking cold.
These people just came here because England sucks. I mean, nobody would live in England if they had a choice, right?
It's too freaking cold there. You know, the freaking country sucks. They freaking come here, you know? It's a big freaking deal.
So if we welcome this new wave of immigrants, no harm will come to us?
Probably not, man.
Yeah, what's the worst that can happen?
And so the Indians lived in harmony with the white man forever, and immigration was never a problem in America again.
Okay, I thought I'd throw in that little demonstration by Super News. What's nice about that particular interpretation is, again, the fear and reaction that people have with regards to immigration. And of course, that cartoon just turned everything around, and it dealt with every stereotype, every prejudice and stereotype that we can think of with regards to not only native peoples and white peoples, but also immigrants. And I thought it was a useful example for us right now. Now, what's clearly going to be important to note for this class, especially as it pertains to Mexican and Latin American immigrant experiences, are the underlying attitudes from the colonial period towards race. Colonialism and the attitudes towards race that developed over time become important for us in our discourse over immigration reform today. Despite the fact the United States is and always has been a nation of immigrants, the immigration process evokes a wide range of responses from various sectors of the U.S. population. And when we talk about immigration, there's always fear, anxiety, sympathy, hate, misunderstanding, racial profiling, scapegoating, and xenophobia. That's why I like to include that one cartoon on, can you imagine if native peoples had had an immigration policy? So all of these anxieties can be traced back to the Spanish, British, and French colonial heritage and their respective attitudes towards race. One of the things that's most important about the immigrant settlers, their religious beliefs, their racial policies, and economic relationships is that, the role of race in Spain and England is important to appreciate. Beyond their religious practices, the English and Spanish colonial worlds diverged substantially in their attitudes towards native peoples and Africans towards slavery and race. The Spanish had a tradition of racial mixing that made it more acceptable for Spanish settlers to engage in sexual unions with both native people and Africans. And meanwhile, for the Anglo-Saxon colonies, interracial mixing was taboo by any class of whites. In fact, race mixing was banned in the United States until the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So, rape or unsanctioned unions obviously occurred, but Anglo-Saxons almost never recognized their mixed-race children, no matter how light-skinned or how poor their offspring. So what's nice to appreciate about the heritage is that in the Spanish world, you're going to recognize that there's all these different colors of skin that are part of the immigrant experience. So people coming from the Caribbean, peoples coming from Central America, have all different mixtures of skins, of skin color, especially because of their African and native heritages. So when we take a look at English settlement, the English rarely incorporated native peoples and into their societies and unions, and natives and whites unions were looked down upon. The English segregated themselves from native peoples. New England Puritans didn't even venture out of their settlements to win converts like the Spanish. And under Elizabeth I, the English confronted the Spanish on a number of fronts, leading to a showdown in 1588. The Queen of England, Elizabeth I, identified Spain as a threat to their national church, now Protestant, with their independence as a nation. So there's always been a Spanish-English controversy that goes back to the colonial period, and there's a Spanish-English controversy, especially here in the Southwest. So while the 16th century was about plunder and exploration, the 17th century witnessed the creation of colonies for the explicit expansion of European markets. So historians note that approximately 600,000 immigrants moved to North America in the 17th century, and between 1630 and 1700, approximately 155,000 English immigrated to the British colonies. And these English immigrants accounted for approximately 90% of European immigrants to the colonies. So by being involuntary, and the next largest group was African slaves who arrived as involuntary immigrants. So by being involuntary, their forced migration reduced the demand for the labor of voluntary migrants from Europe. So All this gets us down to the notion of forming and controlling labor forces for the expansion of colonial markets. So labor recruitment is the key to migration of population since the colonial period. Now, the major distinction amongst European immigrants to the British colonies before the American Revolution was related to the way in which they were able to afford passage to the colonies. Some were able to immigrate based on their own or their family resources. Generally, they had skills or capital, or they worked in a specific profession as they occupied positions in an expanding colonial market. So if you were a government official, if you were part of the clergy, maybe you were a merchant or an artisan or a farmer, if you were a gentry and lesser nobility, if you had the means, you could come into the colonial system. But the mass of immigrants came as indentured servants or as convicts. The indentured were required to perform an average 8 years of labor to repay the price of their passage. Because of a lack of capital and skills, they were forced to perform arduous labor. And many times, because of a lack of opportunity, their indentured status was extended. So their only opportunity for success was the British elimination policy of native peoples from their land. And if they couldn't get land, then they could run away from their oppressive master and join native peoples' resistance movements. So I'm going to try to see if we can go to a film clip emphasizing the importance of indentured servitude to the creation of the United States. Author and worker cooperative member John Curl discusses the Mayflower Compact, indentured servants, and the English corporate investment in the colonial adventures. His book is entitled For All the People, Uncovering the Hidden History of Cooperation, Cooperative Movements, and Communalism. And let's see if we can get that. Good.
This is the story of the Mayflower, actually, of the Pilgrim voyage. On 3 days before or 2 or 3 days before they landed, the majority of the people there, over 50%, were indentured servants. And they staged a revolt on board. And what came out of it is the famous document known as the Mayflower Compact, where all the people there were declared themselves equal, free and equal. They revolted against the form of servitude that most of them had been committed, had signed up to put themselves under. And through a revolt of revolutionary servants, the first New England colony, Plymouth, became a democracy of sorts. It was a limited democracy, but it was the most democratic society at that time in colonial America. Well, in the colonies, most of the colonies, or all of the British colonies, were really set up by corporations. And as soon as possible, people who were hooked into it, who were often indentured servants, where they signed up for passage for a certain number of years, they would have to work off the money that the passage cost, and then they were able to get off on their own. And as soon as they got out, many of them just ran away from that form of bondage and went off into the wilderness. So, but as soon as they got into their own communities, into small towns, small villages, they were basically cooperative communities there. The cooperation was, and democratic procedures were basically the way they settled the country in the early years.
Okay, that was a nice little clip talking about the importance of indentured servitude. Now, most often, indentured rebellions in the southern colonies paved the way for their replacements as workers through the introduction of slavery. White masters do not like it when white workers rebel, so wherever slavery appeared in the British colonial empire, it was usually preceded by white indentured servitude. It was a servitude that many times led to white rebellion. So eventually, the reliance on the African slave trade is going to influence historians to identify the expansion of markets as a triangular trade. So we're going to go to a film clip from the Discovery Channel that helps us appreciate the importance of involuntary immigrants to this country. We're going to take a look at the slave trade.
The trip across the Atlantic was called the Middle Passage. For the enslaved, this was a horrific journey. Life on a slave ship was a nightmare. The Middle Passage could take from 25 to 90 days. At night, slaves were kept below deck in extremely confined conditions. They had far less space than prisoners transported on the same ships.
The mortality was high. 15-20% was not uncommon for people to die on these passages.
The traders saw it as simple economics. They crammed as many Africans into the ship as possible and sold those who survived for the largest possible profit.
The ubiquitous wars that raged through Europe during most of the 17th century were fought not only for territory and power. They determined who would dominate the New World and control the African trade.
Those wars overwhelmingly resulted in British domination because it was England's mastery of the sea, which was particularly clear in the 18th century, that enabled Britain really to dominate the slave trade as a whole.
Britain turned the slave trade into an industry. Its ships alone carried an estimated 3 million Africans to the Americas. But there was still plenty of opportunity for France, the Netherlands, and virtually every other country in Europe to take part in the trade. By the 1700s, money from the trade helped build the cities of Liverpool and Bristol in England, and the French city of Nantes. All of them participated in a great triangle of profit.
The triangular trade is a phrase that's used to emphasize the link between Africa, the tropical Americas, and Europe, hence the triangle. Goods, commodities are shipped from Europe to West Africa to buy slaves. Slaves are taken to the Americas to grow sugar. Those crops are then shipped to Europe, where they're manufactured for re-export to Africa to buy slaves. That's the idea of the triangular trade.
Okay, what is important to note for this class, especially it pertains to the Latin American and Mexican immigrant experience, are the underlying attitudes from the colonial period towards race. Now, colonialism and the attitude towards race that developed over time become important in our discourse over immigration reform today. And as we will come to appreciate in future presentations, the Spanish attempted to incorporate native labor forces by a process of interaction of the races known as mestizaje or mixtures. That is why you see all the wonderful black and brown expressions that make up the immigrant populations arriving from Latin America and Mexico today. They are part of the racial mixing that occurred since colonial times in the Caribbean, from Mexico down to Chile. But the British insistence on separation and removal led to a racist characteristic that you can see spewing from the mouths of those who have disdains for immigrants today. So hopefully we can get to a PBS documentary called Africans in America, America's Journey Through Slavery, because it chronicles indentured servitude in America, and it goes from white indentures to both white and black indentures. So let's appreciate that today's debate on the undocumented immigrant worker can be traced back to colonial times. Let's listen to and understand the current dilemma of the immigrants as they are treated as human cargo for the creation of wealth.
In 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a mystery ship appeared out of a violent storm off the Virginia coast. No one recorded the ship's name, but somewhere on the high seas, she had robbed a Spanish vessel of a cargo of Africans. In search of supplies, she traded the Africans for food. They had been baptized and given Christian names. As Christians, they could not be enslaved for life under English law. Like most Europeans in the colony, they were purchased to work as servants for a limited number of years. The new arrival supplied much-needed labor for the tobacco crop that was making men rich. Settlers were planting tobacco in the streets of Jamestown, carving plantations out of the surrounding wilderness, and shipping some 60,000 pounds a year back to England.
once tobacco is established as a viable commodity, then the more land you control, the bigger profits you can make. And in order to make those profits, you need more labor, and you look for that labor wherever you can find it.
Well, the colony builders initially intended to rely almost exclusively on white indentured servants as a labor force to cultivate the crops that were being grown in Virginia, principally tobacco. And in order to create these raw materials or goods, you often needed labor.
Here's a hand to the company and one to my life.
The world the Africans entered was controlled by wealthy Englishmen and populated by the English poor, most under the age of 25. In return for passage to Virginia, they had traded 4 to 7 years of their labor. They were bound to a master by an indenture form, a contract that defined length of service and the conditions of servitude. Most were promised freedom dues after their service, a bushel of corn, a new suit of clothes, and 100 acres of land. Under Virginia's head right system, a planter was entitled to 50 acres of land where each servant brought into the colony.
The issue always was how long that indenture would be and under what conditions you would be forced to work. At its best, it was a short, friendly apprenticeship. At its worst, it was a long and exploitative situation in which you might die before you ever obtained your freedom.
By 1622, 3,000 new settlers drawn by the opportunities of the tobacco boom had arrived in Virginia. 2 years later, the first Negro child was born in the colony. He was named William Tucker, after a Virginia planter.
Okay, by the 1700s, Spain, Britain, and France are going to be involved in a contest for control of the Caribbean and the Mississippi River. And immigration levels increased vastly in the 18th century. So the Europeans who immigrated to the British colonies are no longer going to primarily come from Anglo-Saxon areas. The populations are going to be more diverse than the previous century. So while 40% of the immigrants were Africans destined for slavery, in the 1700s, the voluntary immigrants included approximately 100,000 Irish. They were descendants of Scottish Presbyterians, approximately 65,000 Germans, as well as Dutch and Scottish immigrants. So each of these groups found homes in specific regions of the eastern seaboard, and they initially sought to create cultural links to the world they left behind. So the Germans, Dutch, Scottish, and Irish are going to join the British in colonizing the first 13 colonies of the United States. And these peoples, German, Dutch, Scottish, and Irish, are going to retain their native languages through the creation of linguistic schools, and they maintain their cultural customs through religion. So the immigrants who created the United States of America benefited from the availability of land. And furthermore, the need for labor was prevalent throughout the era. Colonies actively recruited immigrants. So this need for more workers was emphasized in the Declaration of Independence when the British attempted to discourage immigration in the years leading up to the Revolution. But once the Revolutionary War was over, the number of immigrants grew rapidly. Now, the Constitution did not address the issue of immigration at the outset, but leaders of the Revolution supported unlimited immigration of white Europeans, especially those who were wealthy or skilled, and I'll take that up in in part 2 of the presentation.